You don't belong here. Move to the back of the plane now. This place isn't for your kind.
White woman breaks black girl's leg, and moments later security handcuffs her mid-flight proves that sometimes the elderly passengers who assault black children in first class are about to discover that their age doesn't protect them from consequences, that their deliberate violence caught on cabin cameras means arrest and prison time, that their racist hatred can destroy a child's dreams but will also destroy their own freedom. Because what 74-year-old Edna Carmichael didn't know when she decided 13-year-old Zara Thompson didn't belong in first class was that her vicious kick that shattered the girl's leg would trigger emergency landing, would result in her being handcuffed and removed from aircraft in front of witnesses, would expose pattern of entitlement and hatred that had operated unchecked for decades, would transform routine flight into viral evidence that physical violence against black children still happens in 2025, and the confidence with which Edna extended her leg to strike Zara's shin, the precision with which she aimed her heel at vulnerable dancer's leg, showed how comfortable some people had become expressing racism through violence, how normalized it had become to physically harm black children who occupied spaces where racists believed they didn't belong. Girls like you don't belong in first class. This is for people who actually earn their seats, not welfare cases and their charity tickets. Your kind should be grateful you're even allowed on the plane at all. You think those braids and that cheap hoodie make you first-class material? I've been flying first class for 40 years and I've never had to sit near people like you being treated like royalty when you're nothing but, Edna Carmichael muttered throughout the flight while glaring at Zara Thompson on Delta Airlines Flight 1847 from Chicago to Seattle, muttered loud enough that passengers in nearby rows heard her contempt, muttered with venom that had been building for 90 minutes as she watched flight attendants treat 13-year-old black girl with kindness, watched them bring her blankets and juice, watched them wish her luck at her dance competition, watched this child receive care that Edna believed should be reserved for people who looked like her, and Edna's racial comments weren't whispered privately but spoken with volume that communicated her expectation of agreement, spoken with confidence that other passengers would validate her hatred, spoken with entitlement that came from lifetime of never facing consequences for expressing racism. The words girls like you and your kind landed in first-class cabin with weight of every racist assumption about who deserved comfort and dignity, landed with implication that Zara's presence in premium seating was theft or charity rather than legitimate purchase, landed with hatred that reduced 13-year-old dancer to stereotype, and Zara sitting in seat 3A with headphones on trying to rest before competition heard enough of Edna's muttering to understand she was being targeted, heard enough venom to recognize familiar pattern of adult deciding she didn't belong, heard enough contempt to feel anxiety rising, and the realization that she was being hated by stranger for existing in first-class seat her mother had saved months to afford, for wearing braids that were part of her identity, for accepting kindness from flight attendants who saw her humanity, made her feel small and unwelcome and afraid in space where she should have felt safe, and watching Edna's face twisted with disgust every time flight attendants showed her care made Zara understand that this woman's hatred was personal and dangerous. This wasn't something Zara's mother had warned might happen in distant past. This wasn't discrimination her grandparents had faced during segregation that existed only in history. This was happening right now in 2025 on commercial airline where anti-discrimination policies supposedly existed, where children traveling to competitions were supposedly protected, where first-class passengers were supposedly treated with uniform respect. But here was Edna Carmichael muttering racist commentary for 90 minutes while other passengers heard and said nothing, while flight attendants remained unaware, while 13-year-old black girl tried to ignore hatred being directed at her. And if you think racism on airplanes is something we solved, if you believe first-class cabins are spaces where black children are safe from violence, if you imagine that 2025 means racial hatred has disappeared, then you need to understand that physical assault against black children still happens, still operates through people who believe certain bodies don't belong in certain spaces, maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we're post-racial, while people deny that black passengers still get targeted, while elderly white women feel comfortable enough in their racism to physically attack children. Zara had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who seemed surprised by her excellence, store employees who followed her, adults who made assumptions about her family's finances, but having elderly passenger mutter racial hatred at her for 90 minutes, having someone glare at her with visible contempt throughout flight, having woman decide she didn't deserve first-class seat and kindness from crew, felt different, felt like racism that was building toward something, felt like hatred that wouldn't stay verbal. And when Zara got up 90 minutes into flight to use restroom, when she walked carefully down aisle mindful of legs that were her most valuable asset as dancer, when she approached Edna's row with no warning of what was coming, she was shocked but not entirely surprised by what happened next. Shocked by violence of the attack but not surprised that woman who'd been radiating hatred would act on it, because her mother had taught her that racism could be dangerous, that people who hated you might hurt you, that being excellent black child didn't protect you from adults who believed you didn't belong. Zara walked past Edna's row with careful steps, walked past this elderly woman who'd been glaring at her, walked focused on reaching restroom, and Edna, who'd been watching and waiting and building rage for 90 minutes, shifted suddenly in her seat, positioned herself deliberately, extended her leg with force and precision, and her heel connected directly with Zara's shin in strike that was calculated, that aimed for maximum damage, that represented violence born from hatred, and the impact was brutal, was targeted, was attack designed to hurt, and Zara crashed to the floor screaming, crashed with pain exploding through her leg, crashed clutching her shin while tears streamed, crashed gasping for breath while passengers throughout cabin turned to see what happened, crashed in moment that would change her life forever, that would end her competition season, that would shatter dreams she'd worked toward for 2 years. If you believe children deserve protection from racist violence regardless of their skin color, keep watching, because what happens when cabin cameras reveal Edna's deliberate attack will show you that sometimes justice comes swiftly, and if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere because of how you look, drop a comment below and tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when assaulting black child means handcuffs and federal charges. This story doesn't end the way Edna expects, so hit that like button if you stand against violence and subscribe to this channel, because we're exposing racial attacks that still happen today. Passengers throughout first class gasped hearing Zara scream, gasped seeing 13-year-old girl crash to floor, gasped watching her clutch her leg in obvious agony, and flight attendant named Monica, who'd been kind to Zara, rushed over immediately, rushed kneeling beside the child, rushed with concern visible on her face, and she said, "Sweetheart, what happened? Are you okay? Tell me what hurts?" And Zara, sobbing and unable to speak, could only point weakly at Edna, could only gesture toward woman who'd kicked her, could only try to communicate through tears and pain that this wasn't accident but attack. And Monica, looking at Zara's rapidly swelling leg, seeing injury that was serious, seeing child in crisis, called for medical assistance, while other flight attendant Derek helped move Zara carefully into nearby seat. Edna, watching the response to her violence, immediately began performing innocence, immediately clutched her chest dramatically, immediately said with voice pitched to sound frail, "It was an accident. She tripped over my foot. I didn't do anything. I'm just an old woman. My legs shift sometimes." And her immediate denial, her characterization of deliberate kick as accidental contact, her invocation of age as shield against accountability, represented strategy she'd probably used before. Represented expectation that her appearance would make people doubt the child's account, represented confidence that elderly white woman would be believed over young black girl. But what Edna didn't know was that multiple passengers had witnessed the attack, had seen her position herself, had seen her leg extend with force, had seen violence that was unmistakable. But to understand how 13-year-old honor student with dreams of dancing professionally ended up on airplane floor with shattered leg, how trip that was supposed to be culmination of 2 years of training became moment of racist violence, how Edna Carmichael's hatred collided with child whose only offense was existing in first class. We need to go back 8 hours to morning in Chicago, where this day started not with violence but with excitement and mother's sacrifice and dancers' dreams. Zara Thompson was 13 years old, an 8th grader at Martin Luther King Jr. Academy, was honor roll student who loved mathematics and literature but whose true passion was dance, was girl who'd been dancing since she was 5 years old, who'd trained in ballet and contemporary and hip-hop, who'd won regional competitions, who'd been selected to compete at nationals in Seattle, who'd worked harder than any student her instructor Miss Lorraine had ever taught, and she was being raised by single mother who was nurse at Cook County Hospital, was child of woman who worked double shifts to provide, was daughter who understood sacrifice because she'd watched her mother make it every day, and Zara had been training for this national competition for 2 years, had practiced until her feet bled, had stretched until muscles screamed, had perfected routines until they became second nature, and nationals represented opportunity to be seen by professional companies, to earn scholarships, to transform passion into career, and missing it was an option she'd considered because she'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, dreamed too long. Zara's mother Keisha Thompson was 38 years old and had been single parent since Zara was 2, was woman who'd left abusive relationship to protect her daughter, was nurse who'd worked her way through school while raising child alone, was mother who believed in giving Zara opportunities she'd never had, and when Zara had been selected for nationals Keisha had been so proud, had cried reading the acceptance letter, had immediately started saving for trip even though money was tight, and she'd made decision that felt extravagant but necessary, had decided to book Zara first-class seat, had saved for 3 months taking extra shifts, had sacrificed her own needs, had done without new clothes and meals out and small luxuries, because she wanted Zara to rest properly before competition, wanted her daughter to arrive with legs that weren't cramped from economy seating, wanted to give her child experience of being treated well, of understanding she deserved comfort and care, and that first-class ticket represented more than transportation, represented Keisha's belief in her daughter's worth, represented investment in Zara's dreams, represented love that manifested through sacrifice. That morning Zara had woken early with excitement that made sleeping impossible, had packed her carry-on bag with competition costume that was pink and silver, had carefully folded warm-up clothes, had packed dance shoes that were worn from practice, had included Lucky Charm that was small stuffed elephant her mother had given her when she started dancing, and she'd stood in front of mirror practicing her routine one more time, practicing while her mother watched from doorway, practicing with focus that showed maturity beyond her years, and Keisha had driven her to O'Hare International Airport in their old Honda that barely ran, had spent drive reminding Zara about checking in and finding gate and calling when she landed, had hugged her tight at departures saying I'm so proud of you baby, you're going to be amazing, dance like I taught you to live, with everything you have, and Zara had walked into terminal feeling grown up and responsible and ready, had felt like this trip was beginning of something important, had believed that her hard work was finally going to pay off. Check-in had gone smoothly with agent who processed her ticket and checked her bag. TSA security had been routine with officers who were professional, and she'd proceeded to her gate with 2 hours before boarding, had found seat in waiting area and stretched carefully, had listened to music while visualizing her routines, had texted her mother updates. And when boarding was called for first-class passengers she'd felt moment of pride walking down jetway ahead of other travelers, had felt special in way she rarely experienced, had settled into seat 3A by the window with sense of anticipation, and flight attendant named Monica had been immediately kind, had brought her blanket and orange juice, had said good luck at your competition sweetheart we're rooting for you, and that kindness, that recognition of why she was traveling, that acknowledgement of her dreams, had made Zara feel seen and valued. But Edna Carmichael, who sat across the aisle in seat 3C, had watched Monica's kindness with expression that darkened, had watched this interaction with visible disgust, had looked at Zara in her pink hoodie with braids and had decided immediately that this child didn't belong, that first class was being degraded by her presence, that flight attendants showing her care was affront to proper order, and Edna's face had twisted with contempt seeing black girl being treated well, and she'd begun muttering comments that were meant to be heard, comments about people like that and welfare tickets and standards declining, comments that other passengers noticed but ignored, comments that made businessman in seat 4A frown but say nothing, comments that represented racism that Edna felt comfortable expressing because she'd never faced consequences for it, and her hatred toward Zara built throughout the flight, built as she watched the girl rest peacefully, built as she saw flight attendants check on her, built toward violence that Edna convinced herself was justified, built with resentment that consumed her rational thought, built with rage that this black child was occupying space Edna believed belonged exclusively to people who looked like her. Edna Carmichael was 74 years old and had been flying first class for 40 years, was woman who'd grown up in era when segregation was legal, who'd internalized hierarchy that placed white people above black people, who'd spent lifetime believing certain spaces were meant for certain races, and she'd never confronted those beliefs, never examined the racism that shaped her worldview, never considered that her sense of entitlement was built on foundation of white supremacy, and watching Zara receive kindness that Edna believed should be reserved for white passengers triggered something visceral in her, triggered resentment that had been building her entire life, triggered hatred that she'd learned to express through acceptable channels like muttering and glaring but that was preparing to manifest as violence. And across the aisle this black girl in her pink hoodie represented everything Edna found threatening, represented change she couldn't accept, represented equality she viewed as oppression, represented future where her racism would no longer be tolerated. A black girl in first class being treated like royalty, that's what Edna saw. That's how she characterized Monica's basic kindness. That's how she interpreted flight attendants doing their jobs, and the framing of decent treatment as excessive privilege, the characterization of standard service as royalty, the resentment at seeing black child receive care that should be universal, revealed depth of Edna's racism, revealed her belief that black people should be grateful for scraps not entitled to comfort, revealed worldview where equality felt like oppression because she'd always benefited from inequality, and Edna had flown first class for decades accustomed to certain kind of passenger, accustomed to seeing people who looked like her, accustomed to homogeneity that she found comfortable, and this girl in her pink hoodie with braided hair did not fit Edna's definition of who belonged, did not match her mental image of first-class passenger, did not conform to racist template sheet constructed over lifetime of entitlement. Every kindness shown to Zara deepened Edna's resentment in ways that were visible, deepened with each interaction between flight attendants and this child, deepened until hatred became physical sensation in Edna's chest, and when another flight attendant brought Zara hot towel, when crew member offered this small courtesy that was standard first-class service, Edna muttered under her breath loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, muttered about special treatment and lowered standards and what this airline had become, muttered with venom that was unmistakable, muttered expecting validation from other passengers who she assumed shared her racism, and when Zara politely thanked the crew with voice that was respectful and genuine, when this 13-year-old girl demonstrated manners and grace, Edna scoffed audibly, made sound of contempt that communicated she found Zara's politeness to be performance, found her gratitude to be manipulation, found everything about this child to be offensive, and the scoff was loud enough to make Zara glance over, loud enough to make her aware that woman across aisle disapproved of her, loud enough to plant seed of discomfort that would grow throughout flight. A white businessman in seat 4A noticed Edna's behavior, noticed her muttering and glaring, noticed the way she watched Zara with visible hatred, and he frowned seeing this elderly woman's contempt, frowned recognizing that something toxic was happening, frowned with discomfort that came from witnessing racism, but he said nothing, didn't challenge Edna's comments, didn't ask her to stop, didn't alert flight attendants to situation developing, didn't use his voice or his proximity or his witness to intervene, and his silence, his choice to frown but not act, his decision that observing racism was sufficient without opposing it, represented moral failure that was common, represented tendency of people to recognize injustice without feeling obligated to stop it, represented how bystander silence enabled racism to escalate, and other passengers near Edna also heard her comments, also saw her glaring, also witnessed her hostility toward child who'd done nothing except exist in first class. And they too remained silent, remained in their seats, remained unwilling to get involved, remained complicit through their refusal to speak up. Edna's hatred built systematically throughout the flight, built during beverage service when Monica asked Zara if she wanted anything else, built when flight attendants smiled at the girl, built when Zara stretched her legs carefully in preparation for competition, built with every moment that this black child occupied first class without apology, built with every interaction that treated her as legitimate passenger deserving of care, and the building hatred was visible on Edna's face, was obvious in her body language, was communicated through her constant glaring, was expressed through her muttered commentary, was escalating in ways that should have alarmed someone, that should have triggered intervention, that should have been recognized as dangerous, but flight attendants were busy with service, were unaware of hostility brewing in seat 3C. were missing signs that elderly white woman was spiraling toward violence against black child. Zara felt Edna's hatred even through her headphones, felt it as pressure in the cabin, felt it as eyes boring into her, felt it as sense of being unwelcome that contradicted flight attendants' kindness, and she tried to ignore it, tried to focus on her music and her visualization of competition routines, tried to rest before the biggest performance of her life, tried to maintain excitement despite discomfort of being watched with contempt, but Edna's glaring was persistent, was constant, was impossible to fully ignore, and Zara found herself feeling self-conscious in ways she hadn't expected, found herself questioning whether she really belonged in first class, found herself wondering if other passengers shared Edna's apparent disapproval, and the psychological impact of being targeted by racist hatred, of feeling unwelcome in space her mother had worked so hard to provide, of sensing danger without understanding its full extent, created anxiety that competed with her pre-competition nerves, created stress that her young mind struggled to process, created unease that would prove justified when Edna's hatred transformed from psychological violence into physical attack. 90 minutes into the flight, 90 minutes of Edna's building rage, 90 minutes of muttered comments and hostile glaring, 90 minutes of resentment festering, Zara needed to use the restroom, needed to get up and move, needed to stretch legs that had been still too long, and she removed her headphones and unbuckled her seatbelt with movements that were careful, that showed awareness of her body as instrument, that demonstrated dancers' consciousness of how she moved through space, and she stood and stepped into the aisle with grace that was unconscious, with posture that years of training had made automatic, and she began walking toward the restroom at rear of first-class cabin, walking carefully down the aisle, walking mindful of her legs that were her most valuable asset as dancer, walking with no awareness that Edna was watching her approach with hatred that had reached critical mass, with rage that was about to become violence, with conviction that this black girl needed to be put in her place. As Zara passed Edna's row, as she walked past seat 3C with focus on reaching the restroom, as she moved through space that Edna had been monitoring, the old woman shifted suddenly in her seat, shifted with movement that was deliberate, shifted positioning herself with precision, and her leg shot out into the aisle, shot out with force that was calculated, shot out with heel aimed directly at Zara's shin. And the movement wasn't accidental shift or unintentional contact, but was attack that was planned, was violence that was targeted, was assault that was motivated by race hatred, and Edna's heel connected with Zara's shin with impact that was brutal and precise, connected with force designed to cause maximum damage, connected not with trip or bump, but with deliberate vicious kick that represented 74 years of accumulated racism manifesting as physical violence against 13-year-old child. The impact was devastating, was collision of hard shoe against vulnerable shin bone, was force that exceeded what accidental contact could produce, was strike that came with weight of Edna's body behind it, and Zara felt explosion of pain that was immediate and overwhelming, felt her leg buckle, felt herself losing balance, felt the floor rushing toward her, and she crashed down hard with scream that came from depths of agony, crashed clutching her shin where pain radiated outward, crashed with tears streaming before she'd even fully hit the ground, crashed gasping for breath while her brain tried to process what had happened, crashed in moment that shattered not just her leg but her dreams, crashed while passengers throughout first class gasped in shock, crashed while woman somewhere behind her shrieked, crashed while flight attendants rushed over from galley, crashed ending 2 years of training and sacrifice in single moment of racist violence. Zara lay on the floor of the aircraft clutching her shin while pain exploded through her leg, lay sobbing and unable to speak, lay trying to understand what had happened, lay with mind racing between physical agony and recognition that something terrible had occurred, and passengers throughout cabin gasped hearing her scream, gasped seeing 13-year-old girl crash to floor, gasped with shock at sudden violence, and woman several rows back shrieked with sound that communicated horror, and flight attendants rushed over immediately with Monica reaching Zara first, with Derek close behind, with crew responding to crisis with professionalism born from training, and Monica knelt beside Zara on the floor with concern visible on her face, knelt with gentleness that tried to provide comfort, knelt saying, "Sweetheart, what happened? Are you okay? Tell me what hurts," and her voice carried genuine care, Carried distress at seeing child she'd been kind to now injured and crying. Zara couldn't speak initially, couldn't form words through sobs and pain, couldn't articulate what had happened, could only clutch her leg where agony throbbed, could only cry while her mind tried to process the attack, and she pointed weakly at Edna with hand that shook, pointed trying to communicate without words that this woman had hurt her, pointed with gesture that should have been clear. And Monica, following Zara's indication, looked at Edna, whose face showed expression that was already shifting into performance mode, already preparing defense, already constructing narrative that would frame this as accident, and Edna clutched her chest dramatically, seeing Monica's attention, clutched with gesture designed to convey frailty, clutched with body language that said, "I'm just elderly woman who couldn't possibly hurt anyone." "It was an accident," Edna said with voice pitched to sound weak, with tone that communicated innocence. "She tripped over my foot. I didn't do anything. I'm just old woman whose legs shift sometimes. It's not my fault she's clumsy." And her immediate denial, her characterization of deliberate kick as accidental trip, her invocation of age and frailty as shield against accountability, her suggestion that Zara's clumsiness rather than Edna's violence caused the fall, represented strategy of gaslighting, represented attempt to rewrite what had just happened, represented confidence that elderly white woman's word would be believed over young black girl's experience, and watching Edna perform innocence while Zara lay crying on floor made some passengers uncomfortable, made them sense something wasn't right about old woman's explanation, made them remember the muttering and glaring they'd witnessed throughout flight. Derek, the male flight attendant, helped Zara carefully, helped her move from floor into nearby empty seat, helped with gentleness that recognized she was injured, and Zara's leg was already swelling visibly, was already showing signs of serious trauma, was already demonstrating that this wasn't minor bump but significant injury, and she couldn't put weight on it, couldn't stand without support, couldn't move without pain shooting through her shin, and the realization that something was seriously wrong, that this wasn't bruise that would heal quickly, that her leg might be broken, made fresh wave of panic crash over her, made her cry harder, made her gasp "it hurts so bad" while clutching Derek's arm, and Monica knelt beside the seat where Zara now sat, elevated with leg extended, knelt with face showing growing concern as she assessed swelling. "My leg," Zara whimpered through tears. "My competition? I have nationals tomorrow. I've been training for 2 years. This was supposed to be my chance." And hearing her voice what was being taken from her, hearing her articulate dreams that were slipping away, hearing 13-year-old realize her hard work might be destroyed, broke hearts of flight attendants who were listening, made Monica squeeze her hand with sympathy that was profound, made Derek radio for any medical professionals on board. And the desperation in Zara's voice, the grief already visible in her tears, the recognition that this injury might end her competition season, represented tragedy that went beyond physical pain, represented theft of opportunity, represented racist violence that didn't just hurt body but destroyed dreams. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent while witnessing hatred because speaking up felt uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the voice that challenges racism, because what happens next will show you that silence enables violence, that witnessing isn't protecting. So hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve adults who intervene, not just observe. Monica called out asking if any medical professionals were on board, called with voice that carried urgency, called recognizing that Zara's injury required assessment beyond flight attendant training, and retired orthopedic nurse named Patricia, who'd been sitting in row 7, responded immediately, stood and made her way forward, arrived at Zara's seat with professional demeanor. And she knelt beside the girl asking permission to examine her leg, asking with gentleness that recognized trauma, and Zara nodded through tears, nodded giving consent, nodded hoping this nurse could tell her it wasn't as bad as it felt, and Patricia examined the leg with practiced hands that were gentle but thorough, examined with touches that assessed damage, examined while her expression grew progressively darker, and watching Patricia's face shift from assessment to concern to alarm told Monica and Derek that this was serious, told them medical intervention was needed, told them this child's injury was beyond what they could handle at 30,000 feet, and Patricia looked up at the flight attendants with face that communicated gravity of situation. "This could be a fracture," Patricia said with voice that was professional but carried weight, with tone that made clear she wasn't speculating but making informed assessment. "She needs immediate medical attention. We cannot wait until landing. This injury requires x-rays and possibly surgery. The swelling and the location of impact suggest tibial fracture, and hearing those words, hearing medical professional confirm her worst fears, hearing that her leg might be broken, made Zara's world crumble completely, made everything she'd worked for dissolve, made 2 years of training and sacrifice and preparation become meaningless, made her competition that was scheduled for tomorrow become impossible, made her dreams of being seen by professional companies evaporate, made her mother's sacrifice of those first-class tickets feel wasted, made everything crash down on her 13-year-old shoulders with weight she couldn't bear. Zara looked at her leg that was swelling before her eyes, looked at skin that was already bruising, looked at limb that had carried her through countless hours of practice and performance, looked at part of her body that had been her instrument and her identity, and she sobbed uncontrollably, sobbed with grief that was bottomless, sobbed with loss that felt unbearable, sobbed while passengers throughout cabin watched, sobbed while her future as competitive dancer potentially ended, sobbed while understanding that Edna's kick had stolen more than just caused pain, had stolen opportunity, had stolen dreams, had stolen the moment she'd been working toward since she was 11 years old. And through her sobs she managed to say, I just wanted to dance. I just wanted to make my mama proud. She worked so hard to get me here. She saved for months. And now it's all gone, all of it. 2 years of practice and she's not going to see me compete. I was supposed to make her proud. Monica, hearing Zara's heartbroken words, felt tears spring to her own eyes, felt grief for this child whose dreams were being destroyed, felt rage at whoever had done this, felt helpless watching 13-year-old process magnitude of her loss, and she held Zara's hand tighter, saying, you will, sweetheart, you will make her proud. This isn't over, you're going to dance again. But even as she spoke the reassurances, Monica didn't know if they were true, didn't know if fracture would heal properly. For competitive dancing, didn't know if this child's dreams were salvageable, and the uncertainty, the recognition that optimistic words might be lies, made Monica's own tears fall, made her squeeze Zara's hand with sympathy that couldn't fix anything, with compassion that couldn't undo damage. Meanwhile, Edna continued her performance of innocence from her seat across the aisle, continued with voice that got progressively louder, continued with indignation that seemed designed to deflect attention from Zara's suffering, and she said, I'm an old woman, my legs shift sometimes without my control, arthritis makes my limbs move unpredictably, it's not my fault she's clumsy, it's not my fault she wasn't watching where she was going, I've done nothing wrong, why is everyone treating me like criminal? And her insistence on her innocence, her continued characterization of deliberate violence as accident, her suggestion that Zara rather than Edna bore responsibility, showed commitment to lie, showed confidence that her age and race would protect her, showed expectation that her narrative would prevail, and some passengers hearing her protest looked uncertain, looked like maybe they were considering her explanation, looked like elderly white woman claiming accident might be believable. But businessman in seat 4A who'd frowned at Edna's muttering throughout flight had also watched the attack, had seen what actually happened, had witnessed deliberate nature of kick, and something about hearing Edna lie while child cried made him unable to stay silent anymore, made him understand that witness had responsibility, made him recognize that remaining quiet made him complicit, and he stood from his seat with movement that drew attention, stood with posture that communicated he had something important to say, and passengers throughout cabin turned to look at him, turned with curiosity about why another passenger was standing, turned wondering what he was going to contribute, and Thomas stood there for a moment gathering courage, gathering words, gathering conviction to challenge elderly white woman's narrative, and then he spoke with voice that was firm, that carried clearly through cabin, that cut through Edna's protests. That's not what I saw, Thomas said with tone that was steady, with words that challenged Edna's version directly, with courage that had taken 90 minutes to materialize but that was finally present, and everyone turned toward him, turned to hear what he would say, turned with recognition that someone was finally speaking up, and the cabin fell silent except for Zara's crying, fell silent waiting for Thomas to continue, fell silent with attention focused on this middle-aged white man who was standing in the aisle contradicting elderly white woman's account. And Thomas continued speaking with conviction that grew as he talked, with certainty that came from having witnessed truth, with determination that seemed fueled by regret that he hadn't acted sooner. I watched the whole thing, Thomas said with voice that didn't waver, with words that were precise, with testimony that was damning, That woman waited until the girl walked by, then deliberately kicked her leg out. It was an accident. It was intentional. I saw her position herself. I saw her extend her leg with force. I saw her strike that child's shin deliberately. This wasn't elderly woman's leg shifting unpredictably. This was calculated attack. And I'm willing to testify to exactly what I witnessed, and his account, his explicit contradiction of Edna's narrative, his willingness to name what he'd seen as deliberate violence, changed atmosphere in cabin immediately, changed from uncertainty to clarity, changed passengers' assessment from maybe it was accident to recognition that assault had occurred. Another passenger spoke up then, black woman named Denise who'd been sitting in row 6 and who'd also witnessed Edna's behavior throughout flight, and she stood as well saying I saw it too, with voice that carried emotion, with tone that held both validation for Zara and condemnation for Edna. She was glaring at that child the entire flight. She was muttering racist comments loud enough for me to hear. She was watching that girl with hatred, and when the child walked past her she deliberately kicked her. It was intentional assault. It was violence motivated by racism. I saw everything, and having second witness corroborate Thomas's account, having black woman add her testimony, having multiple passengers now challenging Edna's lies, made truth undeniable, made Edna's defense crumble, made other passengers who'd been uncertain now recognize they'd witnessed crime, made cabin atmosphere shift from confusion to collective understanding that elderly woman had committed violence against child, and Zara hearing passengers defend her, hearing adults finally speaking up, hearing her truth validated by witnesses, felt something shift inside her grief, felt recognition that she wasn't alone, felt gratitude mixing with her pain. Edna's face reddened hearing the testimonies, reddened with combination of rage and panic, reddened with recognition that her lies weren't being believed, and she stood from her seat with movement that was agitated, stood with body language that communicated desperation, stood shouting you're lying, all of you are lying, protecting your own kind, this is discrimination against me, I'm the victim here. I'm elderly woman being persecuted. You're all ganging up on me because of political correctness, because you want to believe worst about white people, and her characterization of witnesses as liars, her accusation that they were protecting their own kind, her claim that she was victim of discrimination, her invocation of persecution narrative, showed she was doubling down on racism even as evidence mounted against her, showed she couldn't conceive that she might be held accountable, showed she believed her whiteness and age entitled her to immunity from consequences. Derek, the flight attendant, had heard enough testimony, had listened to multiple witnesses describe deliberate attack, had watched Edna's story change and contradict itself, had seen Zara's suffering that was real and documented, and he made decision that situation required captain's intervention, made determination that this was beyond crew's ability to handle, made choice to escalate to highest authority on aircraft. And he picked up phone to cockpit while other passengers watched, picked up with hand that was steady despite gravity of what he was reporting, picked up knowing this call would trigger protocols, and he said with voice that was professional, Captain, we have assault situation in the cabin, a minor has been injured, we have medical professional on scene who states injury is serious, possibly fracture, we have multiple witnesses stating the assault was intentional. Passenger who allegedly committed assault is being confrontational and denying responsibility, requesting security protocol and guidance on how to proceed. The captain's voice came back through Derek's earpiece with tone that was grave, with words that communicated he understood severity, understood that assault on minor was crisis requiring immediate response, and he said understood, notify ground security at our destination, document everything, get statements from witnesses, keep alleged assailant separated from victim, and check the cabin cameras. We installed CCTV system last month after incidents. If this assault was deliberate, we should have video evidence. I want that footage pulled immediately, and Derek, hearing mention of cameras, felt relief flood through him, felt recognition that objective evidence would resolve dispute, felt certainty that video would show truth, and he relayed captain's instructions to Monica while passengers nearby overheard mention of cameras and began whispering, began realizing that attack had been recorded, began understanding that Edna's lies would be exposed by technology. What Edna didn't know as she continued protesting her innocence, what she hadn't considered in her rage-fueled decision to kick Zara, what she was about to discover to her horror, was that this particular aircraft had CCTV installed throughout cabin as recent addition after string of in-flight incidents, had cameras that captured passenger interactions, had technology that would provide irrefutable evidence, had recording system that was already being accessed remotely by airline security on ground, and the footage was being pulled even as Edna insisted she'd done nothing wrong, was being reviewed by security personnel who had authority to recommend emergency procedures, was being examined frame by frame to determine what had actually occurred in aisle of first-class cabin, and within minutes of Derek's call to captain, within minutes that felt like hours to Zara who sat crying with elevated leg, within minutes that Edna spent loudly proclaiming her victimhood, airline security on ground had their answer. The video was clear in ways that left no room for interpretation, was footage that showed exactly what Thomas and Denise had testified, was recording that captured Edna's deliberate actions with precision that was damning, and security personnel watching the footage saw Edna notice Zara standing, saw her watch the girl approach, saw her shift in seat positioning herself, saw her track Zara's movement down aisle, and then saw her leg extend outward with force that was unmistakable, saw her heel strike Zara's shin with impact that was calculated, saw attack that was violence not accident, saw assault that was motivated by hatred they'd heard about in Derek's report of racist comments, and the video confirmed what witnesses had stated, confirmed that this wasn't elderly woman's leg accidentally shifting but was deliberate kick aimed at vulnerable child, confirmed that Edna Carmichael had committed assault that was both criminal and racially motivated. Ground security immediately contacted captain with assessment, immediately conveyed that video evidence supported witness testimony of intentional assault, immediately recommended emergency landing and law enforcement response, immediately characterized situation as requiring immediate intervention, and captain receiving this information made decision that would alter course of flight literally and figuratively, made determination that assault on minor warranted diversion, made choice to land at nearest suitable airport rather than continue to Seattle, made call to air traffic control requesting emergency landing clearance, made announcement that would let every passenger know something serious had occurred, and his decision to divert entire aircraft, his willingness to inconvenience hundreds of passengers, his prioritization of justice for injured child over schedule convenience, represented recognition that some situations demanded extraordinary response. Zara sat with leg elevated while Monica stayed beside her providing what comfort she could, sat trying to process physical pain and emotional devastation simultaneously, sat watching her dreams dissolve while strangers debated what had happened to her, sat feeling her leg throb with pain that was getting worse not better, sat recognizing that even if bone wasn't broken the swelling and bruising meant she couldn't dance tomorrow, meant competition she trained for was impossible, meant her mother's sacrifice of first-class ticket had been wasted, meant 2 years of early mornings and late practices and pushing through pain had led to this moment of greater pain, and the unfairness of it, the cruelty of having dreams destroyed by racist strangers' violence, the recognition that she'd done nothing to deserve this except be black child in space where someone decided she didn't belong, made her cry harder, made her grief deepen, made her understand in ways 13-year-old shouldn't. Have to understand that racism could be physically violent, that hatred could destroy your body, that bigotry had power to steal your future, and watching her process this realization, watching innocence die in real time, watching child learn harsh lessons about world's cruelty, broke hearts of flight attendants and witnesses who surrounded her. The captain made his announcement then, made it with voice that came through speakers throughout aircraft, made it with tone that communicated gravity without causing panic, made it with words that were carefully chosen to inform passengers while maintaining order, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making an emergency landing due to a security matter on board. We will be diverting to Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport, which is approximately 20 minutes from our current position. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for immediate landing. This is not a mechanical issue and the aircraft is safe. We are diverting to ensure proper response to a serious incident that occurred in the cabin," and his announcement sent ripple through aircraft, sent wave of murmurs and questions, sent passengers reaching for phones to text loved ones, sent anxiety through cabin as people wondered what security matter warranted emergency landing. Edna, hearing captain's announcement, protested loudly with voice that rose above ambient cabin noise, protested with indignation that seemed to grow rather than diminish, protested saying this is absurd, this is complete overreaction, you cannot divert entire airplane because clumsy girl tripped, I'm 74-year-old woman, you can't do this to me, this is discrimination, this is persecution, I have rights, I have done nothing wrong, and her protests grew more shrill as reality of situation penetrated, grew more desperate as she understood that Captain's decision to divert meant her actions were being taken seriously, grew more frantic as she recognized that her age and her whiteness weren't protecting her the way she'd assumed they would, and she looked around cabins seeking support, seeking passengers who would validate her victimhood narrative, seeking allies who would agree she was being persecuted. But she found only faces that looked away, found only passengers who'd heard testimony and seen Zara's injury and made their own judgments. No one responded to Edna's protests, no passenger came to her defense, no one challenged Captain's decision, and the silence that met her increasingly desperate claims of persecution was different from earlier silence, was rejection rather than passivity, was collective understanding that this woman had committed violence and was now facing consequences. And Derek positioned himself near Edna's row with body language that communicated she was being monitored, with presence that ensured she couldn't approach Zara, with vigilance that kept alleged assailant separated from victim as Captain had instructed, and Edna, seeing Derek's positioning, understanding she was being guarded, seemed to finally grasp that her situation was serious, that her lies weren't being believed, that emergency landing was direct result of her actions. The plane began its descent toward Louisville, began changing altitude in way passengers could feel, began approach that would end this flight 40 minutes early and hundreds of miles short of destination, and as aircraft descended Zara sat holding Monica's hand while tears continued falling, sat processing that competition was gone, sat thinking about phone calls she'd have to make to her mother, sat imagining telling Keisha that first-class ticket had been wasted, that 2 years of training had ended in violence, that dreams they'd both held had been destroyed by strangers' racism, and anticipating that conversation, imagining her mother's devastation and guilt and rage, made Zara cry harder, made her feel like she'd failed somehow, made her want to apologize for being victim of assault she hadn't caused, and Monica, seeing fresh wave of tears, squeezed her hand saying, "This isn't your fault, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. That woman made choice to hurt you. You did nothing wrong." But reassurances couldn't penetrate Zara's grief, couldn't change reality that her body was broken and her dreams were shattered. Thomas, the businessman who'd spoken up, remained standing near Zara's seat, remained positioned where he could provide moral support, remained as witness whose testimony would be needed, and he watched Zara cry with face that showed his own distress, watched with guilt that he hadn't intervened earlier, watched with recognition that his 90 minutes of silence had enabled Edna's hatred to escalate to violence. Watched with understanding that frowning at racism without challenging it had made him complicit, and he said to Zara with voice that was gentle, "You didn't deserve any of that, young lady. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I should have said something when I first heard her comments. I should have alerted crew. I should have challenged her hatred before she hurt you." And his apology, while genuine, couldn't undo damage, couldn't restore what had been taken, couldn't change fact that his silence had contributed to environment where Edna felt comfortable attacking child. Denise, the black woman who'd also testified, moved forward to where Zara sat, moved with face that showed emotion, moved with recognition of shared vulnerability as black woman who understood what it meant to be targeted, and she knelt beside Zara saying, "Baby, I saw what that woman did. I heard her hatred all flight. I should have said something sooner too. I should have protected you before she hurt you. We all should have. Every adult on this plane who heard her comments and stayed silent failed you, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you had to experience that violence. I'm so sorry your dreams got stolen by that woman's racism." And hearing Denise acknowledge not just the attack but the systemic failure of all the adults who'd witnessed Edna's building rage without intervening meant something to Zara, meant recognition that this wasn't just about one racist woman but about culture of silence that enabled violence. Patricia, the nurse, remained with Zara throughout descent, remained monitoring her condition, remained ready to provide medical guidance, and she kept ice pack on the injured leg, kept Zara's leg elevated, kept speaking reassuringly about treatment and recovery, but her face showed concern that went beyond immediate injury, showed recognition that psychological trauma of racist attack would require healing beyond what medicine could provide, showed understanding that this child's body would mend. But her sense of safety had been shattered in ways that would take longer to repair, and she said to Zara, "You're going to dance again, sweetheart. This injury will heal, you're young and strong and your body will recover. It might take months but you will dance again." And whether Zara believed those words or not, she seemed to draw some comfort from them, seemed to need hope even if hope felt distant. The plane touched down at Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport with smooth landing that captain executed perfectly. Touchdown 20 minutes after announcement. Touchdown where ground security and paramedics were already positioned. Touchdown ending flight that had become crime scene. And as aircraft taxied toward gate, Edna's protests reached fever pitch, reached volume that disturbed other passengers, reached desperation that showed she finally understood consequences were imminent. And she said, "You can't arrest me, I haven't done anything, I'm elderly woman, I have grandchildren, I have medical conditions, you can't treat me like criminal, this is America, I have rights." And her invocation of grandchildren and rights and America showed she still believed her identity entitled her to immunity, still thought her demographic characteristics should protect her from accountability, still couldn't accept that assaulting child meant facing justice regardless of her age or race. And the moment aircraft came to complete stop at gate, the doors opened before normal deplaning procedures, opened to admit law enforcement who'd been briefed on situation, opened revealing air marshals who walked directly down aisle with purpose that was unmistakable. 2 air marshals in plain clothes but wearing badges that identified them as federal officers approached Edna's row with faces that showed professional detachment, approached with body language that communicated authority, approached while every passenger watched in silence that was absolute, and the lead marshal said, "Ma'am, I need you to stand up, you're being detained for assault." And Edna, hearing those words, hearing herself accused officially, hearing federal officer name her crime, seemed to understand finally that her situation was dire, seemed to grasp that emergency landing had been specifically for her arrest, seemed to recognize that all her protests and denials had failed, and she began to cry, began with tears that seemed designed to evoke sympathy, began with sobbing that was theatrical, began saying, "This is discrimination, I'm being persecuted, you're arresting me because I'm white and elderly, this is reverse racism, I'm the victim here. Ma'am, stand up please," the marshal repeated with tone that was patient but firm, with voice that communicated he'd heard every excuse and wasn't interested in debating. "We have video evidence of the assault, we have multiple witness statements, you deliberately assaulted a minor on this aircraft, you need to come with us now." And Edna continued crying while slowly standing, continued protesting while being guided into aisle, continued claiming victimhood while every passenger watched her being held accountable. And the second marshal said, "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in court, you have the right to an attorney, if you cannot afford an attorney one will be provided for you." And hearing Miranda rights read to her, hearing herself being processed as criminal, hearing words she'd probably only heard on television shows, made Edna's crying intensify, made her protests become shrieks, made her resistance become physical as she tried to pull away from Marshall's grip. "This is discrimination," Edna screamed as handcuffs were placed around her wrists, screamed with voice that carried through entire first-class cabin. "I'm being persecuted for being white, you're treating me like this because of political correctness, because you want to believe that girl over me, this is injustice, this is violation of my rights as American citizen. I'm 74 years old and you're handcuffing me like I'm dangerous criminal," and watching handcuffs click closed around elderly white woman's wrists created complex emotions in cabin, created discomfort in some passengers who felt sympathy for her age, created satisfaction in others who'd witnessed her racism throughout flight, created vindication for Zara who watched through tears as woman who destroyed her dreams faced immediate consequences, and the marshal responded to Edna's accusations with calm that contrasted her hysteria, responded saying, "Ma'am, we have video evidence showing you deliberately assaulted a minor. This has nothing to do with your race or age, this is about your actions. You injured a child intentionally, that's a crime regardless of who commits it." Edna was escorted down the aisle toward aircraft exit with marshals on either side, escorted past every passenger who'd been on this flight, escorted past Thomas who'd testified against her, escorted past Denise who'd corroborated his account, escorted past businessman who'd frowned but stayed silent, escorted past all the witnesses to her hatred and her violence, and she continued crying and shouting as she was walked through cabin, continued protesting her innocence despite video evidence, continued claiming persecution despite reality of her crime, and as she passed row where Zara sat with elevated injured leg, Edna looked at the girl with expression that held no remorse, looked with face that showed only resentment that this child had caused her arrest, looked with eyes that communicated she blamed Zara for consequences of her own violence, and that look, that absence of remorse, that continued hatred even while being arrested, showed Edna had learned nothing, showed her racism was so deep it survived even this moment of accountability. Passengers began to applaud as Edna was escorted off aircraft, began with slow clapping that built, began with recognition that justice was being served, began with satisfaction at seeing racist violence face immediate consequences, and the applause followed Edna through first class into jetway, followed her as she was walked past windows where other passengers could see her in handcuffs, followed her as she disappeared from view, still protesting, still claiming victimhood, still unable to accept responsibility, and the applause represented collective relief, represented passengers' need to mark this moment, represented their desire to show Zara that they stood against what had happened to her, but the applause also rang hollow because it came after violence had occurred, came after child's leg was broken, came after dreams were destroyed, came too late to protect, only in time to witness consequences. Thomas approached Zara before deplaning, approached with face that showed genuine remorse, approached wanting to say something that might matter even though he knew words couldn't undo damage, and he said, "You didn't deserve any of that, young lady. I'm so sorry I didn't act sooner. I should have spoken up the first time I heard her muttering. I should have alerted crew when I noticed her glaring at you. My silence enabled her to escalate, and I'll carry that guilt, but I want you to know that. I'll testify at her trial. I'll make sure my statement is detailed and clear. I'll do everything I can to ensure she faces full consequences for what she did to you." And his apology, while genuine, couldn't restore what Zara had lost but represented recognition of bystander responsibility, represented acknowledgement that silence had been complicity, represented commitment to do better even though better had come too late. Zara, with leg elevated and tears still drying, managed small smile hearing Thomas's words, managed to say, "Thank you for telling the truth, sir," with voice that was hoarse from crying, managed to extend grace to man who'd failed to protect her but who'd eventually found courage to speak up, and her ability to thank him despite her pain, her capacity to recognize his eventual intervention despite his earlier silence, showed maturity and dignity that made Thomas's eyes fill with tears, showed character that made him understand even more acutely what had been stolen from this child, showed spirit that Edna's violence had hurt but not destroyed, and Thomas nodded, unable to speak, nodded with face that communicated he'd remember this girl forever, nodded with recognition that he'd witnessed something that would change him. Patricia, the nurse, stayed with Zara as other passengers deplaned, stayed as cabin emptied, stayed until paramedics boarded with stretcher and equipment, stayed providing medical continuity and emotional support, and when EMTs arrived she briefed them efficiently, briefed them on mechanism of injury and her assessment and Zara's symptoms, briefed them with professional terminology that communicated severity, and paramedics listening to Patricia's report understood immediately that this child needed hospital, needed x-rays, needed orthopedic evaluation, needed treatment that went beyond first aid, and they began their assessment while Patricia said to Zara, "You're going to be okay, sweetheart. Your leg will heal. You're in good hands now. These paramedics will take excellent care of you, and you will dance again. I promise you that. Dancers are resilient. Your body will recover." And while Patricia couldn't actually promise that Zara would dance competitively again, her certainty, her conviction, her experience as orthopedic nurse who'd seen many injuries heal, gave Zara something to hold on to, gave her thread of hope in moment of despair, gave her reason to believe that this wasn't permanent ending but temporary setback. Paramedics carefully transferred Zara to stretcher with movements that minimized pain, transferred with professional efficiency that recognized urgency, transferred while explaining each step to keep her informed, and they wheeled her off aircraft and through jetway toward waiting ambulance, wheeled past gate agents who watched with concern, wheeled past other passengers who'd witnessed incident and who stopped to watch child they'd seen injured being taken to hospital, and Zara lying on stretcher looking up at fluorescent airport lights, felt surreal disconnection, felt like this was happening to someone else, felt like any moment she'd wake up and be back in seat 3 preparing to land in Seattle for her competition, but the throbbing pain in her leg reminded her this was real, reminded her that racist woman had shattered her shin and her dreams, reminded her that tomorrow she wouldn't be dancing but would be in surgery, and the reality of that, the finality of missing nationals. The recognition that 2 years of work had been stolen made fresh tears fall as paramedics loaded her into ambulance. At University of Louisville Hospital emergency room, Zara was taken immediately to trauma bay, was assessed by doctors who ordered x-rays, was given pain medication that dulled physical agony but couldn't touch emotional devastation, and when x-rays came back confirming fractured tibia, confirming that bone was broken, confirming that surgery would be needed, confirming that months of rehabilitation lay ahead, confirming that her competition season was definitively over, the orthopedic surgeon delivered news with gentleness that recognized he was telling child her dreams were destroyed, and he said, "We're going to fix this. We're going to put your leg back together. The fracture is clean, which means good prognosis for healing, but you'll need surgery tonight. You'll need to be non-weight bearing for weeks. You'll need physical therapy for months, and competitive dancing is going to have to wait. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear, but your body needs time to heal." Zara lay in hospital bed processing surgeon's words, processing timeline that meant missing not just nationals but entire competition season, processing reality that other dancers would be performing while she was in physical therapy, processing that her mother's sacrifice had been wasted, processing that Edna's kick had stolen year of her life, and she began crying again with grief that was bottomless, crying with sobs that made nurses rush over, crying with loss that felt unbearable, and hospital staff watching 13-year-old process magnitude of what had been taken from her felt their own tears threatening, felt rage at whoever had done this to child, felt helpless witnessing suffering they could treat medically but not heal emotionally, and nurse holding Zara's hand while she cried said, "Your mama is on her way. She'll be here soon. You're not alone, sweetheart." And hearing that her mother was coming, knowing she'd have to face Keisha and explain what happened, made Zara cry harder. Keisha Thompson arrived at hospital 90 minutes after receiving call from airline, arrived having driven from Chicago in state of panic, arrived having been told only that Zara was injured and in surgery prep, arrived rushing through emergency room doors still in her nursing scrubs from shift she'd left early, arrived with face that showed terror that only parent whose child is hurt can feel, and when she was directed to Zara's bed, when she saw her daughter lying there with leg immobilized and face swollen from crying, when she took in evidence of trauma both physical and emotional, Keisha's own tears started falling immediately, started with relief that Zara was alive mixing with rage that someone had hurt her, started with guilt that she hadn't been there to protect her, started with grief for dreams she knew were destroyed. "Mama, I'm sorry," Zara said the moment she saw her mother, said with voice that broke completely, "I'm so sorry. I can't dance. I ruined everything. You worked so hard for that ticket and I wasted it. I can't compete tomorrow. I can't make you proud. Everything you sacrificed was for nothing." And her apology, her taking responsibility for being victim, her guilt over ruined ticket and missed competition, her belief that she'd somehow failed her mother, broke Keisha's heart, made her rush to bedside and gather Zara in arms that tried to contain her, tried to hold her together, tried to communicate through embrace that none of this was her fault. "Baby, you didn't ruin anything," Keisha said with voice thick with emotion, with tears falling into Zara's braids. "That woman did. That evil woman who hurt you. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. You were just existing. You were just being beautiful black girl traveling to your competition, and she attacked you because she's racist, because she's hateful, because she couldn't stand seeing you treated with dignity, but that's on her, not on you. You have nothing to apologize for. You're the victim. Here, and she's going to pay for what she did to you. I promise you she's going to pay." And Keisha's fury, her absolute conviction that Edna would face consequences, her protective rage, gave Zara permission to stop feeling guilty, gave her space to be victim rather than person responsible for her own assault, gave her mother's love that was unconditional and fierce. The surgery happened that night, happened with orthopedic surgeon who specialized in sports injuries, happened with team that understood this wasn't just broken bone but broken dreams, happened with care that was excellent, and the fracture was repaired with plate and screws, was fixed in way that gave best possible chance for full recovery, was treated by professionals who understood dancers' body required precision, and surgery was successful in medical terms, in terms of bone alignment and hardware placement, in terms of immediate repair, but success in surgery couldn't undo fact that Zara's competition season was over, couldn't restore opportunities that had been stolen, couldn't give back time and training that had been lost, couldn't erase trauma that would require psychological healing beyond what orthopedics could provide. 3 months later, after investigation and grand jury indictment and pretrial hearings, Edna Carmichael's trial concluded in federal courthouse. Concluded with jury that had watched CCTV footage showing deliberate attack. Concluded with testimony from Thomas and Denise and other passengers. Concluded with evidence that was overwhelming. Concluded with Edna's own statements that revealed her racism. And prosecutor's closing statement was devastating in its clarity, was speech that named exactly what had happened, was argument that connected individual violence to systemic hatred, and prosecutor said Edna Carmichael looked at 13-year-old girl and saw someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't deserve kindness, someone whose dreams could be shattered without consequence. She saw a black child in first class and her racism couldn't tolerate it, so she broke that child's leg. She destroyed that child's competition season. She stole opportunities that child had worked years to earn. She committed violence that was both assault and hate crime, and today we show her and everyone watching that black children's bodies are not targets. Their dreams are not disposable, their lives matter, and the prosecutor's words hung in courtroom with weight that made jury members nod, made spectators cry, made Edna sitting at defense table look smaller and older and more isolated. The jury deliberated for 2 hours, deliberated reviewing video evidence one more time, deliberated discussing testimony they'd heard, deliberated reaching unanimous conclusion, and when they returned to courtroom the foreperson stood and delivered verdict that was unambiguous, stood and said guilty on all counts, guilty of aggravated assault on a minor, guilty with hate crime enhancement, guilty of charges that carried serious prison time, and hearing that word guilty repeated, hearing jury affirmed that what Edna had done was crime, hearing validation that Zara's suffering mattered legally, made Keisha squeeze her daughter's hand, made Zara feel something release in her chest, made both of them cry with relief that justice was being served even though justice couldn't undo damage. The judge who presided over sentencing was elderly black woman with decades on bench, was Judge Harriet Morrison who'd seen countless cases but whose face showed this one had affected her personally, and she looked at Edna with expression that mixed contempt and pity, looked at woman who was 20 years her junior but who seemed to have learned less about humanity in those years. And she said, Mrs. Carmichael, you are 74 years old, you have lived a long life, you have had decades to grow and learn and become better person, and in all those years you never learned that hatred destroys everything it touches including the person who carries it. You looked at beautiful talented child and your racism couldn't tolerate her joy, couldn't tolerate her success, couldn't tolerate seeing her treated with dignity in space you believed belonged only to people who look like you. So you broke her leg, you shattered her dreams, you stole her competition season, you damaged her body and her future because you couldn't stand seeing black girl treated well. Judge Morrison paused letting her words settle, paused looking at Zara who sat in gallery with leg that still sometimes ached, with limp that was mostly gone but not entirely, with dancer's career that had been derailed if not destroyed, and the judge continued saying that child may never dance competitively at level she was reaching before you attacked her, her body has healed but not perfectly, her dreams have been delayed and may never be fully realized, and that damage, that theft of potential, that violence against child's future, warrants sentence that reflects severity of your crime, 5 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole, and lifetime ban from commercial aviation. You will serve every day of those 5 years thinking about the moment you decided black girls' dreams were worth less than your hatred, and maybe in that time you'll finally learn what you should have learned 74 years ago. Edna collapsed hearing the sentence, collapsed with wailing that filled courtroom, collapsed with recognition that she would spend final years of her life in prison, collapsed while her family members who still acknowledged her sat in stunned silence, collapsed while Zara watched without crying, watched without gloating, watched with face that showed she understood this was justice but justice couldn't give back what had been taken, couldn't restore the competition season she'd lost, couldn't erase the chronic pain she now lived with, couldn't undo the trauma that still woke her at night, and she simply nodded watching Edna being led away, simply acknowledged that accountability had come, simply recognized that consequences existed even if they were incomplete. 6 months after the trial, Zara returned to Miss Lorraine's dance studio for first time since injury, returned with leg that was healed medically but that felt different, returned with body that moved differently than it had before, returned with confidence that had been shaken, returned nervous and uncertain and afraid she'd lost everything, and she stood at bar attempting simple routine she'd done 1,000 times before, attempting movements that used to be automatic, attempting to reclaim identity that had been stolen along with her leg's full function, and she stumbled, felt her injured leg protest, felt frustration and grief mixing, and she paused, breathing through tears that threatened, and then she tried again, tried with determination born from refusing to let Edna's violence define her completely, tried with spirit that had survived assault and surgery and months of painful rehabilitation. Miss Lorraine watched from corner as Zara tried the routine again and again, watched her stumble and pause and breathe and try, watched her complete the routine imperfectly and painfully but completely, and she approached with eyes that glistened, saying, "You know what separates good dancers from great ones?" And Zara shook her head, and Miss Lorraine squeezed her hand, saying, "Great ones get back up no matter what knocks them down. Great ones find way forward even when path has changed. Great ones transform their pain into power. You're going to be great, baby girl, greater than you ever imagined, not despite what happened to you but because you're choosing to keep dancing anyway." If you're watching this and you realize you've been the bystander who stayed silent during someone's suffering, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who speaks up before violence happens, because those passengers who watched Edna's hatred build for 90 minutes without intervening will carry guilt forever. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting children matters more than your comfort. 1 year after the attack, Zara took stage at regionals, took stage with leg that was stronger though not what it was, took stage with technique that had been modified to protect her injury, took stage with spirit that was unbreakable even though her body had been broken, and she danced with everything she had, danced like her life depended on proving Edna hadn't destroyed her, danced through pain that was still there, danced imperfectly but powerfully, danced with emotion that made audience feel every movement. And when music ended, the audience erupted with standing ovation, erupted with recognition that they'd witnessed not just performance but triumph, erupted with tears that matched the tears on Zara's face as she stood center stage realizing she'd done it, she'd danced competitively again, and judges wiped their eyes, awarding her first place not just for technique but for courage, for resilience, for refusing to let violence win. In audience, Keisha sobbed with joy and grief and pride all mixed together, sobbed watching daughter who'd been broken dance again, sobbed recognizing that Zara would never be exactly who she was before Edna's attack but was becoming someone different and also strong. And beside Keisha sat Thomas, who'd stayed in touch throughout year, who'd attended every competition cheering Zara on, who'd tried through his presence to somehow atone for 90 minutes of silence, and he wiped his own eyes, saying, "That's my girl," with voice that held both pride and ongoing guilt. And Keisha squeezed his hand, acknowledging his support while knowing it couldn't undo his earlier failure but mattered anyway. But the resolution wasn't perfect because Zara's leg never fully healed to pre-injury capacity, because she developed chronic pain that flared during intensive training, because she had to modify her technique in ways that limited some movements, because professional dance career she dreamed of became impossible due to physical limitations, because she developed PTSD around flying and crowded spaces, because she required ongoing therapy for trauma that persisted, because nightmares about attack continued years later, because Edna's violence had permanently altered her body and her future, and 5 years in prison for Edna didn't undo any of that, didn't restore what had been stolen, didn't erase scars both physical and psychological, and Edna herself learned nothing in prison, spent 5 years bitter rather than remorseful, was released at 79 unemployable and alone. Died 2 years later having never apologized, having never accepted responsibility, having never grown beyond racism that had defined her. And Zara went on to teach dance to young black girls, went on to create space where children like her could feel safe, went on to use her trauma to protect others, went on dancing in modified ways, went on living with permanent limp and chronic pain and memories that wouldn't fade, went on carrying consequences of violence she never deserved. And that imperfect justice, that incomplete healing, that lasting damage, was what real resolution looked like when racism destroyed dreams but couldn't quite destroy the person.